Throughout human history, people have had to struggle with a phenomenon we refer to as a plague. There are an overwhelming number of these events to review throughout the popular historical narrative when considering this topic, but here's a quick timeline of some of the most notorious plagues humanity has ever recorded. 430 to 427 BC, Athens. 165 to 180 AD, Rome. 543 to the Byzantine Empire, spreads into Western Europe. 1346, the Black Death breaks out in Crimea. 1348, the Black Death reaches England. 1492, the Americas. 1603, London. 1633, London. 1665, plague breaks out in London for the last time, and the entire city burns a year later. 1720 to 1722, southern France. I think you're starting to get the picture. For the majority of history, different parts of the world have been stricken with horrible diseases that seem to overwhelm the population and cause these mass die-off events. For this video, we will be focusing on the most famous plague probably ever in history, notoriously referred to as the Black Death. To most, the Black Death is a vaguely defined period of time in the medieval ages where a horrible disease killed off most of the world's population due to increased trading between continents, allowing the disease to be carried by rats on merchant ships. Let's review the official narrative that is most popularly taught as the timeline of the Black Death. 1331, the Black Death emerges in Central Asia. It was said to be caused by Yersinia pestis and is present in fleas carried by rodents. It travels along the Silk Road as rodents migrated from Asia's famine-ridden lands until it came to Crimea when the siege was ongoing. The strain of Yersinia pestis emerges in Mongolia according to John Kelly's account in The Great Mortality. It is possibly passed to humans by a terabagan, a type of marmot. The deadliest outbreak is in the Mongol capital of Sarai, which the Mongols carry west to the Black Seas. 1346. Mongol King Janaberg and his army are at the nearby city of Tana when a brawl erupts between Italian merchants and a group of Muslims. Following the death of one of the Muslims, the Italians flee by sea to the Genoese outpost of Kaffa, and Janaberg follow on land. Upon arrival at Kaffa, Janaberg's army lays siege for a year, while the Mongols laid siege to the city of Kaffa. According to an account of the events of Crimea, the Tartars, Mongols, were suddenly struck by the pandemic. The spread of the plague through the ranks of the Mongols demoralized the army, and a large bulk of them lost interest in the siege. However, the Mongols would not back off, not without giving Kaffa a piece of their own torment. They put the corpses of the dead on their catapults and flung them over the defensive walls of Kaffa. The dwellers of Kaffa watched as rotten bodies fell from the sky, crashing on their soil, spreading their putrid smell in all directions. The Christians could neither hide nor flee from the havoc that rained down upon them. They moved as many rotten bodies as they could, dumping them into the sea as quickly as they could. But by then, it was too late. The Black Death was already in Kaffa. As the army catapults the infected bodies of the dead over their city walls, the under-siege Genoese becomes infected also. May 1347. Both sides of the siege are decimated and survivors in Kaffa escape by sea, leaving behind streets covered with corpses being fed on by feral animals. One ship arrives in Constantinople, which, once infected, loses as much as 90% of its population. October 1347. Another coffin ship docks in Sicily, the crew barely alive. Here the plague kills half the population and moves to Messina. Fleeing residents then spread to the mainland Italy, where 1/3 of the population is dead by the following summer. November 1347. The plague arrives in France, brought by another of the Kaffa ships docking in Marseille. It spreads quickly through the country. January 1348. A different plague strain enters Europe through Genoa, brought by another coffin ship that docks there. The Genoans attack the ship and drive it away, but they are still infected. Italy faces the second strain while already battling the previous one. Yersinia pestis also heads east from Sicily into the Persian Empire and through Greece, Bulgaria, Romania, and Poland, and south of Egypt, as well as Cyprus, which is also hit with destruction from an earthquake and deadly tidal wave at the same time. 1300s were wild, y'all. Venice faces its own outbreak by pioneering the first organized response, with committees ordering ships inspections and burning those with contagions, shutting down taverns, and restricting wine from unknown sources. The canals fill with gondolas, shouting officials instructions for disposing of dead bodies. Despite those efforts, the plague kills 60% of the Venetian population. April 1348. The plague awakes an anti-Semitic rage around Europe, causing repeated massacres of Jewish communities, with the first one taking place in Provence, where 40 Jews were murdered. June 1348. The plague enters England through the port of Malcolm Regis in Dorset. As it spreads through the town, some escape by fleeing inland, inadvertently spreading it further. Summer 1348. A group of religious zealots known as the Flagellants first begin to appear in Germany. These groups of anywhere from 15 to 500 hooded and half-naked men march, sing, and thrash themselves with lashes until swollen and bloody. Originally the practice of 11th century Italian monks during an epidemic, they spread out through Europe. Also known for violent anti-Semitism, the Flagellants mysteriously disappeared by 1350. The plague hits Marseille, Paris, and Normandy, and then the strain splits, with one strain moving onward now into Belgian city of Tournai to the east, and the other passing through Calais and Avignon, where 50% of the population dies. The plague also moves through Austria and Switzerland, where a fury of anti-Semitic massacres follow it, along with the Rhine after a rumor spreads that Jews had caused the plague by poisoning wells, as Jennifer Wright details in her book Get Well Soon, History's Worst Plagues and the Heroes Who Fought Them. In towns throughout Germany and France, Jewish communities are completely annihilated. In response, King Casimir III of Poland offers a safe haven to the persecuted Jews, starting a mass migration to Poland and Lithuania. Marseille is also considered to be a safe haven for Jews. October 1348. Following the infection and death of King Edward III's daughter, Princess Joanne, the plague reaches London according to King Death. The Black Death and its aftermath in late medieval England by Colin Platt. Also the devastation grows. Londoners flee in the countryside to find food. Edward blames the plague on garbage and human excrement piled up in the London streets and the Thames River. The Thames River. I don't know how that's said. February 1349. One of the worst massacres of Jews during the Black Death takes place on Valentine's Day in Strasbourg, with 2,000 Jewish people being burned alive. In the spring, 3,000 Jews defended themselves in Mainz against Christians but are overcome and slaughtered. April 1349. The plague hits Wales, brought by people fleeing from southern England, and eventually kills 100,000 people there. July 1349. An English ship brings the Black Death to Norway, where it runs aground in Bergen. The ship's crew is dead by the end of the week, and the pestilence travels to Denmark and Sweden, where the king believes fasting on a Friday and foregoing shoes on a Sunday will please God and end the plague. It doesn't work, shockingly, killing 2 of the king's brothers and moving into Russia and also eastern Greenland. March 1350. Scotland, having so far avoided the plague, hopes to take advantage of English weakness by amassing an army and planning an invasion. While waiting on the border to begin the attack, troops become infected, with 5,000 dying. Choosing to retreat, the soldiers bring the disease back to their families, and a third of Scotland perishes. Black Death fades, leaving half of Europe dead. 1351. The plague spread significantly begins to peter out, possibly thanks to quarantine efforts, after causing the deaths of anywhere between 25 to 50 million people and leading to the massacre of 210 Jewish communities. All total, Europe has lost about 50% of its population. 1353. With the Black Death considered safely behind them, the people of Europe face a changed society. The combination of the massive death rate and the numbers of survivors fleeing their homes sends entrenched social and economic systems spiraling. It becomes easier to get work for better wages, and the average standard of living rises. With the feudal system dying, the aristocracy tries to pass laws preventing any further rise by the peasants, leading to upheaval and revolution in England and France. Significant losses, with older intellectual communities brought on by an unprecedented opportunity for new ideas and art concepts to take hold, directly leading to the Renaissance and a more youthful, enlightened period of humanity. In the end, the Black Death was responsible for 75 to 200 million deaths in Eurasia. Having killed between 30 to 60% of Europe's population and about half of China's population, it is one of the most devastating plagues in history, and it has marked the earliest use of biological weapon in the history of warfare. Having killed between 30 to 60% of Europe's population and about half of China's population, it is one of the most devastating plagues in history, and it marked the earliest use of biological weaponry in the history of warfare. So even according to the most popular narrative of this time in history, the Black Death was all the result of very early biological warfare? But I thought this was all about rats. Well, while this may be the most commonly held understanding of the plague, modern scientists are not in agreement. According to Harry Cockburn of The Independent, Black Death was caused by humans, not rats, says study. Quote, computer modeling carried out by a research team from the universities of Oslo and Fare suggests that the first outbreak may not have been down to the rats, but instead can, quote, largely ascribed to human fleas and body lice, unquote. Using mortality data from 9 outbreaks of the plague in Europe between the 14th and 19th centuries, the researchers plotted how the disease would likely spread by different means. 7 out of the 9 models indicated the transmission of human fleas and lice was most likely cause of the disease spread when compared to the transfer by rats, fleas, or airborne transmission. In the paper published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, the researchers said, while it is commonly assumed that rats and their fleas spread the plague during the second pandemic, there is little historical and archaeological support for this claim. Quote, here we show that human ectoparasites like body lice and human fleas might be more likely than rats to have caused the rapidly developing epidemics in pre-industrial Europe. Speaking to the BBC, Professor Nils Stenseth from the University of Oslo said, we have good mortality data from the outbreaks in 9 cities in Europe, so we could construct models of the disease dynamics there. He added, the conclusion was very clear. The lice model fits best. So upon further inspection, it's pretty evident that mainstream science has not yet come to an absolute conclusion to explain this devastating plague. There seems to be an absolute agreement on the disease itself being Yersinia pestis. However, the origins of the strain are sketchy at best. Using our modern lens, we could speculate over whether or not the disease was truly animal to human transmission or possibly a very early instance of premeditated biological war. For some, questioning whether or not the Black Death could have been a more calculated incident of biological warfare that went far beyond its intended scope of influence might be a stretch too far. But before we just turn our brains off, let's dig deeper into the historical context of biological warfare. According to a paper by Stephen Rydell, MD, PhD of Baylor University, and a comprehensive review of bioterrorism published by the NCBI, the first recorded use of biological warfare dates back to 600 BC, when Solon, an Athenian statesman, used a purgative herb called hellebore during the siege of Crissa. Another prior incident dates back to 1155 AD in Tortona, Italy, when Emperor Barbossa poisoned wells with human bodies. So this essentially means that humans had been experimenting with the idea of biological weapons for 1,930 years before the Mongolian siege of Kaffa and Crimea. Does it really sound so crazy that there might be more to the origins of the Black Death than a simple marmot to human transfer? As Stephen Rydell writes in his aforementioned paper, the ultimate origins of the plague remain uncertain. Several countries in the Far East, China, Mongolia, India, and Central Asia have been suggested. However, given the complex ecology and epidemiology of plague, it may be an oversimplification to assume that a single biological attack was the sole cause of the plague epidemic in Kaffa. So now that we've established a disconnection between the popular narrative and what mainstream science actually thinks of the plague, let's investigate further strange accounts of what was taking place in the world at this time. Quote, the symptoms were not the same as in the East, where a gush of blood from the nose was the plain sign of inevitable death, but it began both in men and women with certain swellings in the groin or under the armpit. They grew the size of a small apple or an egg, more or less, and were vulgarly called tumors. In short space of time, these tumors spread from 2 parts name all over the body. Soon after, the symptoms changed and black-purple spots appeared on the arms or thighs of any other part of the body. sometimes a few large ones, sometimes many little ones. These spots were a certain sign of death, just as the original tumor had been and still remained, of the symptoms by Giovanni Boccaccio in the Decameron. So nature killed many through corruptions. Death came driving after her and dashed all to dust. Kings and knights, emperors and popes, he left no man standing, whether learned or ignorant. William Langland, 1330 to 1387. The personal accounts of this time that historians have used to piece together their story makes the 1340s sound completely apocalyptic. While there are dozens of authoritative sources that collected these testimonies, they almost begin to meld together in some grotesque milieu of buboes and skeletons. For the purpose of this video, we're going to take a look into some of the stranger accounts that I've found while digging through this research. Of all the strange incidents that have been recorded from this period, the strangest to me are the accounts of comets or shooting stars or unidentified flying objects that seem to disperse some toxic vapor over the east and west alike. Date, 1317. Location, Russia. A strange circular UFO plagued the city of Tver for over a week, before eventually moving northward and out of sight. The circle, which was bright green and emitted a pulsating red glow at its center, produced 3 rays, 2 pointing eastward and 1 westward. Source, Valentin Krapiva. Date, 1319. Location, Russia. People observed fiery pillars. They extend from the ground toward the sky. Some also cited a heavenly arc, yet others saw horse-like flying entities equipped with lanterns. Source, Philip Mantle, Paul Stonehill, UFO-USSR. Date, 1320. Location, Durham, England. After the abbot of Durham Abbey died and was buried, a strange light was seen to descend from the sky and move about over his grave. Source, Robert de Greytanes, History du Milnesis, as published by Historia du Milnesis Scriptores, London, Edinburgh. Date, November 4th, 1322. Location, Uxbridge, England. In the first hour of the night, there was seen in the sky over Uxbridge a pillar of fire the size of a small boat, pallid and in living color. It rose from the south, crossed the sky with a slow and grave motion, and went north. Out of the front of the pillar, a fervent red flame burst forth with great beams of light. Its speed increased, and flew through the air. Many beholders saw it in collision, and there came blows as a fearful combat, and sounds of crashes were heard at a distance. Source, Flora's Historian, attributed to Robert of Reading. Date, 1330. Location, Bonnet, France. Summary, a tapestry depicting the life of the 14th of Mary the Magnificent, Notre Dame in Bonnet. Date, 1338. Location, Chantilly, France. Summary, Book of Good Manners, France by Jacques Legrand. Date, 1347 to 1315 AD. Location, Florence, Italy. Summary, writer Gianfranco degli Esposti mentions that reports relating to the period of the famous Black Plague between 1347 and 1350 speak of strange cigar-shaped objects slowly crossing the sky, sometimes at low altitude, dispersing in their passage a disturbing mist, unquote. He attributes the Black Plague to these objects because immediately after the appearance of these shocking events, the epidemic exploded in the area. In Florence, a huge mass of vapors appeared in the sky. Coming from the north, it spread throughout the land. In the east, in the same year, many animals fell from the sky. Their decomposing animal carcasses were said to make the air fetid and to cause the spread of the infamous illness that was fatal in India, Asia, and Britain. In Florence alone, it killed 60,000 people. Source, Gianfranco degli Esposti, Travis di Fulco, I can't pronounce that. Another account comes from a legend passed around Central Europe and Scandinavia. Perhaps the strangest and most touching of all the horrible things brought by the Black Death was the legend of Pest Jungfrau. This was the plague angel, a spirit that flew across the land as a blue flame spreading the contagion. One of the most famous plagues of religious history was the 6th of 10 plagues that Moses forewarned to the Egyptian pharaoh. What's interesting to me here is this excerpt from the Bible. Exodus 9:8. And the Lord said unto Moses and unto Aaron, Take to you handfuls of ashes of the furnace, and let Moses sprinkle it toward the heaven in the sight of Pharaoh. 9:9. And it shall become small dust in all of the land of Egypt, and shall be a boil breaking forth with blains upon man and upon beast throughout all the land of Egypt. There are a handful of researchers who have focused on UFOs in medieval text and imagery. If you're interested in this subject, I'll list some books I've cited. Wonders in the Sky, Unexplained Aerial Objects from Antiquity to Modern Times by Jacques Vallée and Chris Albeck, Russian researcher Valentin Kripiva, the works of Italian ufologist Gianfranco degli Esposti, and The Gods of Eden by William Bramley. To quote William Bramley, the Black Death was actually a four-part event. First, there was famine. Then there was disease. Then there was human-on-human massacres based on religious fanaticism. And at some point in all of this, there was a much more visible manifestation of UFOs and mysterious, quote, men in black, unquote, spreading aerosols that people claimed were causing the plague. Bramley also tells us of similar phenomenon occurring in later plagues of the 1500s and 1600s. Fascinatingly, there were also accounts of horrible men, demons with fearful faces, dressed in black and carrying long scythes, brooms, and swords that were directly associated with plague and outbreaks. A single phenomenon was sometimes reported, the appearance of frightening human-like figures dressed in black. Those figures were often seen on the outskirts of a town village, and their presence would signal the outbreak of an epidemic almost immediately. A summary written in 1682 tells of one such visitor a century earlier. Quote, in Brandenburg, in Germany, there appeared in 1559 horrible men, of whom at first 15 and later on 12 were seen. The foremost had beside their posterior little heads, the others fearful faces and long scythes, with which they cut the oats so that the swish could be heard at a great distance, but the oats remained standing. When a quantity of people came running out to see them, they went on with their mowing. The visit of the strange men to the oat fields was followed immediately by a severe outbreak of plague in Brandenburg. This incident raises intriguing questions. Who were the mysterious figures? What were the long scythe-like instruments that they held emitting a loud swooshing sound? It appears that the scythes may have been long instruments designed to spray poison or germ-laden gas. That means the town people misinterpreted the movement of the scythes as an attempt to cut the oats. In fact, the movements were the act of spraying aerosols into the town. Similar men dressed in black were reported in Hungary. In the mountain towns of Hungary on Ascension Day, in the evenings of the great, quote, in the mountain towns of Hungary on Ascension Day, in the evening of the great perturbation, disturbance of all, when on the Schulisberg there appeared so many black riders that the opinion was prevalent that the Turks were making a secret raid, but who rapidly disappeared again, and thereupon a raging plague broke out in the neighborhood. In the year of Christ, 1571, was seen at Kremnitz. Strange men dressed in black, quote, demons, unquote, and other terrifying figures were observed in other European communities. The frightened creatures were often observed carrying long brooms, scythes, or a sword that were used to sweep or knock at the doors of people's homes. The inhabitants of those homes fell ill with plague afterwards. It is from these reports that people created the popular image of death as a skeleton or demon carrying a scythe. The scythe came to symbolize the act of death mowing down people like the stalks of grain. So that was all quoted from Gods of Eden by William Bramley, page 184, citing Noel Joannes, The Black Death, The Chronicle of the Plague, London, George Allen and Antoine Lut, 1926, page 59.
Imagine a virus, the most terrifying virus you can, and then imagine that you and you alone have the cure. But if your ultimate goal is power, how best to use such a weapon?
There's a switch. If you throw it, half the people on Earth will die. But if you don't, the human race will be extinct in 100 years.
Malaria? The only disease that needs curing is us.
That's millions of lives, hundreds of millions even.
And there are 7 billion on this planet. 100 million won't even make a dent. We're trying to save the species. If it costs a few million individuals, isn't that okay?
You're controlling the future of human civilization.
Is that what they're calling it? It's a very nice euphemism for a species that is replicated like a contagion across the planet, killing all other species in its wake.
This should be underlined in blood. You belong to me.
There's been a lot of accusations thrown around about the origins and spread of the Black Death of the 1300s. What historians and scientists can't seem to agree on is what made the pathogen spread so viciously through the population that were seemingly disconnected at the time, save for their trade routes. The popular theory of the plague fails to explain how the plague managed to infect towns and populations that were shut off from the rest of the world at the time. So if the plague was created as a biological weapon, who created it and why? Sadly, thousands would fall victim to the fear campaign orchestrated by the Catholic Church. Jews, Muslims, pagans, and witches were all used as scapegoats in a desperate attempt to maintain the church's widespread influence and authority. Here's an excerpt from the article Why Were Jews Blamed for the Black Death by Dan Friedman of Moment magazine. Quote, "Within 1 year, all the Jews between Cologne and Austria were burnt," wrote one contemporary observer, Heinrich Trusus von Dissenhoven, as recounted in the 1994 book The Black Death, a compendium of documents translated and edited by Rosemary Horrocks. "And in Austria they await the same fate, for they are accursed of God." Another chronicle by Franciscan friar Hermann Gigas states, "In a number of regions, many people, nobles and humbles alike, have laid plans against them and their defenders, which they will never abandon until the whole Jewish race has been destroyed." Stories circulated of a plot against Christianity originating in the Jewish community of Toledo in Spain and carried forward by a Rabbi Peyrit in Chambry, the capital of what was then Savoy, southeastern France. Local authorities and mobs depend on forced confessions of justification for attacks on Jewish populations. Typically, Jews were, quote, on the wheel and tortured, unquote, until they confessed to elaborate plots, often involving rabbis from faraway places, instructing them by letter to poison wells in an effort to decimate Christianity. One such confessor said the poison had been formulated from frogs, lizards, spiders, and Christian hearts, according to the Jewish Encyclopedia's account. The poison was wrapped in cloth until it was about the size of a large nut, and then deposited in wells or springs, the confessor declared. Pope Clement V attempted to put a halt to anti-Jewish violence, noting the illogic of Jewish spreading disease through poisoning of wells. Quote, "Throughout many parts of the world, the same plague by the hidden judgment of God has afflicted and afflicts the Jews themselves and many other races who have never lived alongside them," unquote, he wrote. Some officials gave ways to the mobs. Others found ways to profit. The Holy Roman Empire, facing tax losses if Jews were annihilated, acquiesced to the destruction of Jews in Nuremberg and elsewhere in return for a cut of the wealth derived from the seizure of Jewish possessions. But the Catholic Church has not been saved from accusation. According to 10 Facts That Will Change How You View the Black Death by Gregory Myers of Listverse, quote, "The Catholic Church has been one of the most powerful organizations in the world for quite some time, so it is perhaps not too surprising that there are a lot of conspiracy theories about it, and it has become a popular scapegoat for many situations. In terms of the Black Death, no one is suggesting that the Church tried specifically to cause it, but they do suggest that the Church's alleged backward thinking and practices helped it spread more effectively and cause deaths overall. The claims say that the disease came mostly to humans from fleas, and that these fleas came from rats. At this point, the popular theory does seem to unravel a bit, as fleas could travel alongside many other animals besides rats. Regardless, some like to claim that due to Catholic superstitions, cats were originally blamed for the Black Death. This led to mass cullings of cats, which caused the rats to spread and populate far quicker than they normally would have. According to popular mythology, the massive destruction of felines directly helped the Black Death get off the ground as a major pandemic, and it was all the Church's fault. The problem with this theory, apart from many historians not believing that rats had a big role, as people claim, is that there is really no evidence of this mass cat culling due to Catholic superstition. It's an oft-repeated story by cat lovers on the internet to promote the virtues of their beloved choice of pet, but none of it appears to be sourced on anything solid. So just what was the Catholic Church's response to the Black Death? Here's what John Berger of Alicia.com wrote on his article, A Lesson from History, Pope Clement and the Plague. Quote, "For the needy he arranged for burials and even bought a piece of land to be used as a plague cemetery," writes Frans van Leer, a historian at historical horizons. Quote, of course, he was also a spiritual leader, and he alleviated some of the spiritual anxieties by instituting a special mass for the cessation of the plague, and, more importantly, he provided a general absolution of all sins for victims of the plague who had died without proper confession or receiving their last rites. There were misunderstandings about the origin of the deadly disease that struck people down swiftly. Some people blamed the Jews for it, claiming it was a plot to wipe out Christianity. These conspiracy theorists said that Jews were poisoning wells and springs, and unfortunately some Jews confessed under torture. Soon pogroms ensued throughout Germany, von Leer writes. While in many places numerous Jews were massacred by the populace as being the cause of the pestilence, Clement issued bulls for their protection and afforded them a refuge in his little state. The Society of St. Pius X states in their article titled The Church and the Plague, Medieval and Modern Times, Part 3 of 4, quote, indeed it changed the face of the European world. Bereft of laborers, the value of land declined, undermining the foundations of the feudal system and easing the way for centralized monarchies. For many, religious fervor was renewed, and new manifestations of piety appeared. Others, however, reacted with a new pessimism that threw them into despair or a senseless hedonism, which were in turn reflected in the arts and literature. Many others responded with random acts of violence against those thought to have caused the plague, not only Jewish people, but also people affected by other illnesses, as well as beggars and foreigners. Amidst the upheaval, priests stepped into sick rooms, materially and spiritually assisting the sick and dying, knowing that they faced an unseen enemy that would very likely kill them. Nonetheless, thousands of priests took those steps anyway, risking their lives to give hope and comfort to those in pain and fear. Widespread diseases reappeared continuously through the world, even into our century, and every time the church's response was the same, unquote. Though the church positions itself as the good guys during this time of strife, it should be known that the Catholic Church had played its part in the utter genocide of the pagan cultures of Europe and in the Middle East. Also, the way that the decentralized Catholic world responded to the scapegoating of Jews would suggest that the Church largely saw this time in history as an opportunity to renew the population's faith and also to terrify large swaths of heathens into their religious dogma. Though the pantheon of conspiracies surrounding the Church are vast and abundant, you'd be right to question the possibility of the Church's involvement. And remember, the origins of Yersinia pestis are largely considered to stem from China. So how does the Catholic Church share a relationship to China? You don't need to look too far into the history of the Catholic Church before you will be shocked and horrified by the antics of the saintly priest class of the medieval era. Priests were educated to the highest degree of anyone born outside of royalty. In antiquity, some cultures, one was expected to be trained as a priest if they were ever to claim the title of king. Regardless of your religious beliefs, it's important that we are all able to accept the atrocities manifested by religious zealots and their controlling classes throughout history. For more evidence of this activity, watch the video, How the Medieval Church Frightened People into Obedience, made by Weird History on YouTube. Or just do any general research into the Crusades, the Spanish Inquisition, the pagan genocide, etc. If the Catholic Church had some hand in the proliferation of the Black Death, we need to investigate its relationship to China during this time. It's important to point out that the West and the East had established connection dating back to 329 BCE when Alexander the Great expanded Macedonia's territory into Central Asia. This long predates the commonly held belief that Marco Polo was the first Westerner to visit China. I even found this BBC article titled, Western Contact with China Begins Long Before Marco Polo, Experts Say, from 2016. Quote, archaeologists say inspiration for the terracotta warriors found at the tomb of the first emperor near today's Xi'an may have come from ancient Greece. They also say that ancient Greek artisans could have been training locals there in the 3rd century BC. Polo's 13th century journey to China was the first to be well documented. However, Chinese historians recorded much earlier visits by people thought by some to have been emissaries from the Roman Empire during the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. we have all the evidence that close contact existed between the first emperor's China and the West before the formal opening of the Silk Road. This is far earlier than we formerly thought, unquote, said senior archaeologist Li Zhuzhen from the Emperor Qi Shi Huang's Mausoleum Site Museum. Said senior archaeologist Li Zhuzhen from the Emperor Qi Shi Huang's Mausoleum Site Museum. So if the West and the East had established relationships dating back to antiquity, is it such a stretch that if the West and the East had established relationships dating back to antiquity, is it such a stretch to imagine that relationship held out throughout China's periods of isolation? By the 1st century AD, there was already an established flow of silk to the Persian and Roman empires from China. The Silk Road was the trade route that opened the East to the West. Christianity would enter China through this trade route. In 1551 AD, during the Huan dynasty, 2 unidentified monks, most likely members of the Nestorian Church who had been preaching Christianity in India, the Church of the East in India, made their way to China. They cut a deal with Justinian I of Byzantia in 552 AD, and trade relations with China were officially established with the Eastern Roman Empire. While Christianity took hold in China, it never became the dominant religion. This is helped in part by the strict opposition later dynasties would take in their approach to treat the new religion. However, even after Christianity's initial decline in China during the late 800s AD, the religion was still kept alive by small sects of converts in both Chinese and Mongolian populations. Here's an excerpt that I found from Wikipedia. The decline of Christianity in China. The Church in the East declined in China substantially in the mid-14th century. Several contemporaries, including the papal envoy John of Marignoli, mention the murder of the Latin bishop Richard and 6 of his companions in 1339 or 1340 by a Muslim mob in Almeek, the chief city of Tangut, and the forcible conversion of the city's Christians to Islam. The last tombstones in the East Syriac cemeteries discovered in Tangut, and the forcible conversion of the city's Christians to Islam. The last tombstones in the East Syriac cemeteries discovered in Mongolia around the end of the 19th century date from 1342, and several commemorate deaths during the plague in 1338. In China, the last reference to the East Syriac and Latin Christians date from the 1350s, and it's likely that all foreign Christians were expelled from China soon after the revolutions of 1368, which replaced the Mongol Huan dynasty with the xenophobic Ming dynasty. China would go through an intense period of alleged isolation for several centuries, but we see the connections to the Catholic Church always reemerge later on in history. It's also interesting to note that the breakup, or I guess the disintegration of Christianity during the 1300s correlates with the Black Death. In 1287, the elderly Bar Sama embarked on his journey to Europe, bearing gifts and letters from Argon to the Eastern Roman Emperor, the Pope, and the European kings. He followed the embassy of another Nestorian, Isa Kalmichi, sent by Argon to Pope Honorius V in 1285. It's interesting to note that even in 1287, a Syrian Nestorian Christian scientist, Isa Kilmechi, was an official and translator to the Huan court of Kublai Khan's Mongol Empire in the 13th century. In 1552, we see China's connections to the church reestablished through Jesuit priest St. Francis Xavier. Jesuits would eventually go on to be highly revered members of later Chinese dynastic rulers, but there always seems to be an air of tension that exists between Chinese rulership and the Western religion. So we've taken a good look at the official narrative of the Black Death. We've established the cultural and religious context of the world at the time. We've seen some incredibly strange accounts from history regarding this area, and we've speculated on what purposes a power structure might have in using biological warfare against their enemies and their domestic population. So let's scratch a bit further past the surface and try to consider why a governing body might ever want to use biological warfare on their own populations. In 2013, a paper was published titled Pathogens and Politics: Further Evidence That Parasite Prevalence Predicts Authoritarianism on the National Institute of Health's website. This paper goes on to explain how the parasite stress test shows that populations are much more likely to submit to authoritarian rule when subjected to fear of pandemics. Derek Brose of The Last American Vagabond expounds on this idea using several other similar studies in his article, the rise of authoritarianism from parasite stress theory to lockstep. And just because the church had a legitimate motive in taking out their enemies and gaining more ground as the dominant world religion, doesn't mean that they are the only culprit. No governing body or hierarchical power structure is infallible or pure, and to only call out the actions of the church would be unfair to the litany of other mass-murdering psychopaths from all walks of life. The purpose of this video was to serve as an outlet for my personal thought process on this age-old conspiracy. I am far from the first person to make this hypothesis. During my research, I even found this forum page from 2007 where conspiracy researchers at the time were making some good points on the topic at hand. 1. It was impossible for such a deadly disease to spread entirely by rats, especially in Iceland where thousands died but there was no rat population. This climate was not adept to sustain the huge rat populations that needed to spread the disease. 2. For the disease to have jumped from rats to humans, all of the rats would have had to have died. There are no historical records of a large rat die-off or really any reference to rats dying. 3. The direction is spread from China, Asia, Asia Minor, into Western Europe, then north to England and back eastwards through Poland and into Russia. Studies have shown the natural spread of the disease would have long engulfed Russia rather than lollygagging a big semicircle around the heretic regions first and then finally getting to the barbarians. 4. The symptoms indicate differently than what's regularly told. Yes, in some cases, buboes were formed, blood clots and lymph nodes. Often the symptoms vary, but definitely a lot of evidence is here pertaining to respiratory problems, often associated with the coughing of blood, as well as smaller, redder marks appearing on the body. So evidence is available indicating a deeper and darker motive for the Black Death. Considering the wealth of the church elite during the time, quadrupled over quadrupled in wealth, though through the obtaining of entire new lands and manors and raw materials and resources for production, raw wealth like gold and precious metals, as well as weak and fragile population, all the more easier to convince. There's also this great thread posted to Stolen History titled Black Plague, Black Death Hoax. Now might be a good time to mention I've linked all 40 plus tabs of my research in the info to this video, and I have the transcript saved as a document that I can send to anyone that's interested in expounding on the research I compiled from other researchers. Conspiracy researcher C.R. Berry actually seems to develop a fairly well thought out theory in his work, quoting from his article titled The Black Death, a Deliberate Plot to Wipe Out the West. Quote, Stanford University liberal arts scholar L. Anandavali says that there is no evidence that the Black Death struck India in the 14th century. Why is that? How could it spread via India if it never actually infected India? Well, the theory is that the rulers of India, feeling that their Western trading partners were taking advantage of them, devised a plan to annihilate them. They had heard about a plague having hit China. The rumor began that it was spread by infected rats. The Indian rulers carefully sourced rats thought to be infected and placed them on ships bound for the port cities of the Mediterranean. Once the plague had devastated the Western nations, India would march an army into Europe and conquer it. So while I disagree with Berry's culprit, we share a lot of the same suspicions behind the proliferation of the plague and its origins as it admitted biological attack. To contradict Mr. Berry's assessment, researchers now heavily debate whether rats were the prime spreader of Yersinia pestis as we established earlier. If you take anything away from this video, I hope it is this. History is nowhere near as cut and dry as most historians would like you to believe. The cookie-cutter historical narratives that we were taught in high school are simplified at best and outright lies at worst. If we deny ourselves the opportunity to learn through questioning history, we may miss a lot of opportunities to use that question as a chance to learn more about a subject than ever before. Even if you think the ideas postulated in this video are absurd or laughable, I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the timeline. I certainly can say that I learned a lot more about the Black Death than I had ever known through the process of putting together this hypothesis. I was blown away by the sheer amount of debate that I found throughout my research into this topic, and I hope that some of you were as well. We will probably never get a good answer as to what truly caused the Black Plague to be as prolific and nightmarish as historians say. Also, I'm totally open to debate on whether or not the historical timelines I used to create my hypothesis are even valid. Also, I'm totally open for debate on whether or not the historical timelines I used to create my hypothesis are even valid, because in the words of Napoleon Bonaparte, history is a lie agreed upon.